today we're going to talk a bit about renunciation, which is very much linked to sensuality and the danger of sensuality. So I prepared several quotes for us here, and I'll explain and provide some commentary. So first off, how does renunciation appear and come to be in our life? And so the Buddha addresses the monks by saying, thought of renunciation arises with a source, not without a source. And how is this so? In dependence on the renunciation element, there arises perception of renunciation. In dependence on perception of renunciation, there arises intention of renunciation. In dependence on intention of renunciation, there arises desire for renunciation. In dependence on desire for renunciation, there arises passion for renunciation. In dependence on passion for renunciation, there arises a quest for renunciation. Engaged in a quest for renunciation, the instructed noble disciple conducts him or herself rightly in 3 ways, with body, speech, and mind. So first we start with the element of renunciation, or this renunciation element, which is perhaps could just be seen as just a thought, or the state of renunciation, or the fact that renunciation can exist in the world, and through renunciation being elemental, or being a state, being something that can be done, we begin to have perceptions about it. And this is very much linked to the idea of samanasanya, or asaji. When Venerable Sariputta, before he became a monk, he saw a monk walking in the street, so serene, with eyes downcast, pulling away from the world. And these are kind of perceptions of renunciation, or we can imagine ourselves in the future, or pulling away and not engaging so much in sensuality the same way we did, or imagine ourselves practicing meditation or going for a retreat. So these are perceptions that can be cultivated. Through these perceptions there arises an intention. Oh, how nice would it be if I were to practice meditation more, or go for a retreat, or simply seeing other people, lay people or monastics, who are engaged in renouncing sensuality or renouncing the world. This can stir up an intention, this drive, this direction for us to incorporate renunciation in our own lives. In dependence on this intention, there arises desire. And so not all desire is unwholesome. Not all desire is bad. It's a kind of fuel that, you fuel up the car and it will take you somewhere. But it can also take you to bad destinations as well. And the Buddha quite clearly says that these kind of desires that lead to the reduction of unwholesome states should be cultivated. And here we have the desire for renunciation. And in dependence on this desire, there arises passion. So a desire might be momentary or fleeting. It might rise up, but to actually cultivate a sense of, this is what I'm going to do with my time, it's a bit more sustained desire. We can see this with people with their careers, how they've cultivated a certain passion for art, or whatever skill it might be, for science, that it begins to, all of their thoughts and intentions and actions really are driven towards this. In this case, renunciation. And in dependence on this passion for renunciation, there arises a quest for renunciation. So the initial desire, this passion which leads us onwards, which keeps us going, and then the quest, which involves, well, as we talked about previously, renunciation in regard to our material possessions through generosity, renunciation in certain actions by body, speech, or mind, renunciation in sensuality, renouncing the world, and striving for successively more sublime and superior states of existence with heaven. So these are all forms of renouncing and letting go and releasing. And so in this quest, one would conduct themselves rightly by body, speech, or mind. In short, these are the 10 wholesome courses of action. And these actions, this quest, this desire, these intentions and perceptions, they lead us to a certain kind of happiness. And the Buddha talks about two kinds of happiness. There's a happiness which is bound up and tied with sensuality, with sense pleasure. Whatever we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch that is in the world that gives us pleasant feeling that we find delightful, this is sensual pleasure. But the other kind of happiness is the happiness of renunciation, not having to see something or hear something, to smell something or taste something, get something, to be happy. And so it's a happiness, it's a well-being that sustains itself without needing any kind of fuel. It's a happiness that is born out of seclusion, and this really is pointing towards the jhanas. And I feel like if I say jhana, people might get afraid, oh no, I cannot get that. But I imagine that if anybody's engaged in the 5 precepts, engaged in generosity, perhaps meditation, that at some point you've at least tasted what jhana is like. In the passage where the Buddha became awakened, or when he was striving for awakening and he was putting his body through various forms of asceticism, painful asceticism, and he said, okay, this is not the way. Perhaps there's another way. And he thought back to when he was a child, sitting under the rose apple tree, the kind of pleasant feeling that he was experiencing as a boy. He was not an ascetic at this time, not a monastic, not striving for liberation, yet he was able to taste and feel that kind of bliss that was secluded from unwholesome states. So the hindrances, but also unwholesome ways by body, speech, or mind. He was secluded from sensuality. And with thought and examination he entered upon, perhaps not entered and abided, but he was able to have a glimpse at a kind of happiness that was free from sensuality. So if the Buddha could do this as a boy, I certainly think that more people have access to this than we would think. It's not a domain that is just for people who are meditating 9-10 hours a day. And so the Buddha talks about this in a particular sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 99, where he says, I praise the right way of practice on the part either of a householder or one gone forth. For whether it be a householder or one gone forth, one who has entered on the right way of practice, by reason of his right way of practice, is accomplishing the true way, the Dhamma that is wholesome. So while the monastics might have more Vinaya rules, or we might have more time to dedicate to learning the Buddha's teaching, to practicing, and so forth, there is still the opportunity as people living in the world who still own houses to also practice truthfully and rightfully and correctly. And rather, I think it would be more valuable a householder or a lay practitioner who is practicing the Dhamma, who understands the Buddha's teaching, to be more valuable than a monastic who doesn't practice, who doesn't understand the Buddha's teachings. Because in that monastic, if that continues on in the sasana, that is the end of the sasana. Whereas a lay practitioner, he is continuing on the Buddha's teaching. And so renunciation and practicing the true way, this is something that's not easy, and it's something that the Buddha even struggled with. And there's some passages that speak about this, where another layman had come to the Buddha and he said, we laymen enjoy sense pleasures, delight in sensual pleasures. We take delight in sensual pleasures and rejoice in sensual pleasures. Renunciation seems like a precipice to us, so a steep cliff, a fall off. This is something that Bhante Arya talks about when people who are newly ordained, in that there will be a valley, before life, your movies or whatever else you were enjoying in life. But when you become a monk, it's like all the sensuality, all the pleasure that you had bottoms out. And so the quicker that you can bridge the gap where you can find well-being from your practice, from sila, and so forth, the easier it is to bridge that gap. But the longer it is, the more, deprived one might feel, like I'm not getting any well-being, any happiness from the holy life. And so this is what this person is talking about here. He goes on to say, I have heard that in this Dhamma and discipline there are very young bhikkhus whose minds launch out upon renunciation and become placid, settled, and liberated in it, seeing it as peaceful. So this very much goes against the stream of what the world tells us to do. Get a job, get a wife, get a family, enjoy as much as you can. There's a whole song about this in the West called YOLO, you only live once, or Carpe Diem, seize the day. So the world very much encourages us to live life to its fullest. And so anything that goes against that, it doesn't seem to be right. How can I have happiness and joy? How can I see it as peaceful when I've pulled away from the very things that bring me pleasant feeling? He goes on to say that renunciation, Bhante, is the dividing line between the multitude and the bhikkhus in this Dhamma and discipline. The world is carried forward by this stream that seek out sensuality at all costs. But what the Buddha talks about and what asceticism talks about in general is that there is something to be found by pulling away from that sensuality, by renouncing it. And so this is where the Buddha chimes in. He says, before my enlightenment, while I was just a bodhisattva, not just fully enlightened, it occurred to me too, good is renunciation, good is solitude. So I'm not sure if this was when he was still living at home or when he just started to practice, but he saw renunciation as solitude as a good thing to engage in. But he goes on to say, yet my mind did not launch out upon renunciation and become placid, settled, and liberated in it, though I saw it was peaceful. So he saw it as the preferable state, yet his mind was not reaching out to it. And I remember this very much went on my first meditation retreat, and you're sitting there hours upon hours, day after day, and you can see how the stilling of thoughts would be agreeable. I would like to still my thoughts, or I would like to have sensuality less. But it's almost like whenever you go to sit down on the cushion again, the mind is very much afraid. It's like pulling away from it. Oh no, don't take me there again. So it's like the mind has this momentum, and whenever we try to practice meditation or sila or so forth, when we try to practice the Dhamma, it's pushing against this momentum, which might not always be so easy. It's like having a steel ball in a can, huh? And all our lives we've been shaking this ball. But as soon as you stop the can, or we've been shaking the can, as soon as you stop the can stopped, but the ball is still moving around it. And so he said, why is it that my mind does not launch out upon renunciation and become placid, settled and liberated in it, though I see it as peaceful? Then it occurred to me, I have not seen the danger in sensual pleasures and have not cultivated that insight. I have not achieved the benefit in renunciation and have not pursued it. And so this links back to the last talk we had, where if we do not cultivate the sense of danger in sensuality, renunciation will be more difficult for us. And so whenever we go out to engage in sensual activity, that this is an opportunity, it's an event for us to bring in this sense of danger, this perception of danger. Oh, why buy a new iPhone? It is only going to break. It is of a nature to break. Or all the work I had to do to get money so that I can purchase this iPhone. Perceptions such as these is seeing the danger. And the Buddha also talks about this when he speaks about two kinds of thoughts, the thoughts of sensual pleasure and the thoughts of renunciation. And when he divided his mind like that, whenever a thought of sensuality came up, he said, okay, this is leading away from wisdom, leading away from nibbana, leading away from relinquishment. Whereas when I think about renunciation, this cultivates wisdom, and this heads directly towards nibbana. And this is the kind of joy that is derived through renunciation, when by knowing the impermanence, the changing, fading away and cessation of forms, one sees it as it actually is with proper wisdom, that forms both formally and now are all impermanent, dukkha, and subject to change. When one reflects like this, joy arises. This is the mind finding joy and well-being with reality, and kind of giving up the quest of seeking out, knowing that it is impermanent, knowing that it is dukkha and unsatisfactory. By cultivating these perceptions again and again, the mind starts to look for an alternative to how can it be happy and peaceful. And so I think the last passage that I'll point out, it talks about 4 persons in the world, but I think this one would be most relevant for those who do not have the time to go on retreat so much. And it says, how has a person not gone on retreat by body, but gone on retreat by mind? Here some person does not resort to remote lodgings in forests and jungle groves, but he thinks thoughts of renunciation. And it is in this way that a person has not gone on retreat by body, but gone on retreat by mind. So while it is the most optimal environment to spend time at SBSRC, or take a jungle retreat, or whatever it might be, we can carry our renunciation with us wherever we go. We can carry our practice with us wherever we go. And slowly over time, minute by minute, day by day, it can culminate, it can grow, it can create something that is truly worthwhile, and creating a kind of happiness that is free from sensuality, a self-sustained happiness, where we're not so dependent on external conditions.